In 1969, the Doors found themselves in a disastrous situation. Their lead singer Jim Morrison had been arrested again and wanted to leave the band. It soon became one disaster after another as their careers spiraled downhill. But their contract required them to make one more album. This arrest in Miami forever changed Jim Morrison's destiny, one that ultimately ended in his death just months after this final album was released. By the end of the 60s, the Doors had established themselves as one of America's most successful yet enigmatic bands, helped in no small part by their lead singer Jim Morrison, one of rock music's most charismatic frontmen. 1969 was meant to be the best year yet for the Doors, the year when they finally caught up to the Beatles, but things soon went downhill. After starting the year with a sold-out show in Madison Square Garden, in March, things took a turn for the worse. Ahead of a show in Miami, Jim Morrison missed his flight and arrived drunk and over an hour late to the gig. 12,000 fans were packed into the venue, and soon after the show began, Morrison began acting erratically and shouting at the audience. So much so that during just their second song, the rest of the band had to stop midway through. But things got even worse. Doors keyboardist Ray Manzarek explains how Jim Morrison started to take his clothes off.
He takes his shirt off in the middle of the set and says, "You know, you people haven't come to hear a rock and roll." He's drunk as a skunk, and he didn't tell any of us what he was going to do. If only he'd have told somebody. He said, "You didn't come to hear a rock and roll band play some pretty good songs. You came to see something, didn't you?"
Jim Morrison was accused of fully exposing himself, but Ray is certain that this didn't happen, and he was instead just teasing the audience. The whole show did, however, turn into a near riot.
They started coming on a rickety little stage, and the entire stage collapsed.
Despite the other members of the Doors maintaining his innocence, Jim Morrison was convicted and sentenced to 6 months in jail, as well as paying a $500 fine. Morrison had actually been arrested 4 times before this, but this occasion took the Doors into a downward spiral. Concert promoters didn't want to book them, radio stations didn't want to play their music, and Jim Morrison wanted to leave the band. In December 1970, during what would be their final public performance, Jim Morrison's behaviour culminated in a breakdown during a show, slamming the microphone into the stage and refusing to perform. It seemed inevitable that the Doors would end. But at least they continued to make records, so the record label was happy. Well, that was until they decided to release a compilation album without any input from the band. Jim Morrison didn't like it and threatened to leave the label, but he was told that their contract required them to make one more album. So here were the Doors, in as much difficulty as a band can get in without splitting up, needing to make things work for one final album. The new album also got off to a difficult start. In an attempt to avoid the high costs of a professional recording studio, they built a makeshift studio within their usual rehearsal space. This rehearsal space was by no means a typical studio. For starters, it didn't have an isolated vocal booth, so Morrison set up a vocal booth in the bathroom. The equipment wasn't particularly fancy either. The vocal microphone was one that Jim had used on a previous tour, presumably one that wasn't slammed into the stage. They also had little material to work with, so instead of bringing fully worked out songs like they had done in the past, they instead adopted this technique of improvising, jamming, and trying to work out songs as they made the record. For all of their previous albums, they'd worked with producer Paul Rothchild, but Paul walked out early on during the recording process, claiming that this way of creating music resulted in nothing more than cocktail jazz.
I said, "This album is going to be a disaster." I just got up, went into the studio, and said, "Hey, listen, I'm bored. First time in my life I've been in a studio and I've had my head down on the console."
It seemed like at every turn the Doors were hit by another problem. But actually, there was a silver lining. All these problems gave them creative constraints, and led to a working environment which was so successful when they first started making records. When the Doors started out, they began as a 4-piece band making raw, authentic music, with plenty of space for each of the 4 musicians. Over time, with each new album, they tried harder to achieve perfection. For The Soft Parade, for example, each song contained hundreds of takes, and became by far their most expensive album. Sound engineer Bruce Botnick described this process with Jim Morrison as like pulling teeth. But for this final album, LA Woman, the makeshift studio and the absence of their producer forced them to return to a creative process that worked so well in the past.
We just did it like a garage band record. Now that was brilliant, and it worked exquisitely.
Simple and bluesy and just, it was the bare bones, the essence of what we were about. And rock and roll is supposed to be out of a garage.
Engineer Bruce Botnick this time said Morrison was easy to work with and was consuming little alcohol. This album was a chance for Jim Morrison to redeem himself. The incident in Miami had changed him. Although his behaviour on stage often went too far, he felt he had been wrongly convicted. And with their career spiralling downhill, this album was a chance to save their legacy. The album was completed in just 6 days, each song being recorded in just a few takes. The final song Jim Morrison ever recorded was the beautifully haunting final song, Riders on the Storm. As they were finishing the album, Jim Morrison announced that he was leaving.
I'm going to Paris. I said, whoa, what a good idea, man. I thought it was an excellent idea. He said, go ahead and finish it up. You know, you get 2 or 3 songs. Everything sounds great, man. I'm leaving tomorrow for Paris.
Given what had happened over the last couple of years, this didn't come as too much of a surprise. It was expected that this would be the Doors' last album, and despite the success of making LA Woman, Jim Morrison needed to start a new life with a clean slate. He again maintained his innocence. I wasted a lot of time and energy with the Miami trial, about 1.5 years. If I hadn't have had unlimited funds to continue fighting my case, I'd be in jail right now for 3 years. Jim Morrison died in Paris just over 2 months after the release of the album. The cause of death was given as heart failure, but the true circumstances surrounding his death remain disputed to this day. Musically, however, LA Woman gave them a finished story. They'd done a full circle back to how they first started making music. They weren't expected to tour again, they weren't expected to make any more records. This was now a finished story. Doors guitarist Robbie Krieger said, "I'm glad that LA Woman was our last album. It really captured what we were about. The first record did too, but LA Woman is more loose. It's live. It sounds almost like a rehearsal. It's pure Doors." But there's one more ending that Jim Morrison never did get to see. What became of the Miami trial? The one that derailed his and the band's career. The one that he and the rest of the band maintained he was innocent from. In 2010, the day after what would have been Jim Morrison's 67th birthday, Florida Governor Charlie Crist and the State Clemency Board unanimously signed a complete posthumous pardon for Jim Morrison. Morrison was indeed wrongly convicted for what happened in Miami, but there's no doubt that this incident changed him. It's a large part of why this album is so raw and authentic, and it's a large part of why he moved to Paris. But ultimately, it makes little difference to his legacy, as there's no doubt he has one he would have wanted. Not as a criminal being part of a band with a tarnished legacy, but instead, as Ray Manzarek puts it, madness, frenzy, and a chaotic American poet.